My name is Catalina Baker. I am 30 years old, and I will never forget the Christmas night my father decided I did not belong. The house was glowing with lights, music and laughter carried through the walls, but none of it was meant for me. In a single moment, I was stripped of dignity, left standing in the cold while the people I once called family toasted, without me. He told me I was too poor to ever sit at his table, and in that instant, I understood that his love had a price I could never pay. That night was supposed to be about family, yet it became the night I finally saw the truth behind the man the world admired. What I uncovered after that moment would unravel years of lies and force open secrets no one was ready to face. And it all began with one question that haunted me as the storm raged around me. If he could cast me out so easily, what else was he capable of? Snowflakes clung to my lashes the moment the front door slammed behind me, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses muffled by the heavy wood. My heels slid against the ice on the steps, and before I could steady myself, my father's hand shoved me down another level. My breath caught in my throat as the cold bit through the thin fabric of my dress. I stumbled into the blizzard, the wind cutting like knives across my bare arms. Behind me, through the frosted window, the glow of the Christmas tree sparkled as if mocking me. Inside, they were warm and bright and fed. Out here, I was nothing but an embarrassment to be cast aside. I turned desperate for some trace of compassion, but my father's face was hard as stone. Richard Baker, the man everyone in Milwaukee called a pillar of strength, looked at me like I was less than the snow beneath his polished shoes. His words were steady, cruel, practiced. "You are too poor to belong here." It was not shouted, he didn't need to. Each word carried the weight of a hammer. His hand lifted, gesturing at the door I could not enter again. For a moment I thought he might drag me further down the steps, but instead he watched as the wind whipped my hair across my face, satisfied that humiliation had been served. The snowstorm howled through the driveway, filling my ears with a roar like the ocean. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering, my breath turning to clouds that scattered as quickly as they appeared. Inside, I could hear the faintest echo of my sister Emily's laughter. She loved moments like this, watching me shrink under our father's shadow. My brother Thomas would not say anything either. He never did. He knew which side of the money kept him comfortable. The icy air clawed down my throat with each breath. I thought of my dress, chosen carefully so it would not look cheap, even though I had bought it at a clearance rack at Macy's. My shoes, already damp, offered no protection. The snowflakes stuck to the fabric, melting into wet patches that spread across my skin. My teeth chattered, but I kept my eyes on the front door, hoping anyone would notice. Nothing. Just another burst of laughter, muffled and distant, like a cruel reminder of where I did not belong. I wanted to scream, to pound on the door, to remind them that I was blood, their daughter, their sister. But the words froze in my throat. I had spent 30 years learning that in this family silence was survival. To argue, to plead only fed their amusement. My father thrived on displays of weakness, collecting them like trophies. I knew if I begged it would be remembered for years. Retold with a sneer at cocktail parties, whispered over golf games. Catalina, the poor girl who could not even face a snowstorm without crying. No, I thought, not this time. The wind whipped harder, carrying flecks of ice that stung my cheeks. My legs trembled as I stepped down onto the driveway, the snow rising past my ankles. The world outside the house was swallowed in white, the street barely visible. The trees bent under the weight of winter. I felt small, so terribly small against the storm. For a heartbeat, I considered walking anywhere just to keep moving, to stop feeling like a discarded thing. But 37 miles separated this mansion from the small apartment I called home, and in this weather I would not make it past the next block. A memory crept in uninvited. My mother's voice from when I was a child, hushed and trembling. "Don't argue with him, Catalina. Keep your head down." The lesson had been drilled into me before I was old enough to tie my shoes. I had seen her silenced so many times, her spirit caged by his iron grip. Now here I was carrying that legacy, thrown into the storm because I dared to exist without his approval. For years I wondered if I was strong enough to break the pattern. Tonight the answer seemed to be blowing in the frozen wind. The blizzard thickened, flakes swirling so fast they blurred the edges of the world. My body shuddered with every gust. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, a small anchor against the numbness creeping up my arms. How long had it been? A minute 5, time warped in the cold. My chest burned with the effort to breathe. A sound cut through the storm, low and steady, different from the howling wind. Headlights pierced the veil of snow, growing brighter, closer. Tires crunched over the ice as a dark SUV pulled into the driveway. For a moment, fear prickled down my spine. Was this another humiliation? Had my father called someone to witness his daughter tossed out like trash? The engine hummed as the vehicle slowed. I froze, every muscle tensed, ready to run, even though there was nowhere to go. The driver's door opened with a heavy thud and a figure stepped out, tall and broad against the storm. The beam of headlights caught his face and I recognized him. Daniel Moore. He moved with calm purpose as though the snow and wind did not touch him. Daniel shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it across my shoulders. The sudden warmth was overwhelming, the fabric smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. My body sagged with relief, and for the first time that night I let out a sound, not a cry, but a long, shuddering exhale. His voice reached me through the storm, low and steady. "You shouldn't be out here." The words seemed absurdly simple compared to the cruelty I had endured minutes before, but in that moment they were everything. Someone saw me. Someone cared enough to cover me from the storm. Behind us, the mansion loomed, its windows glowing with golden light. I could almost picture them raising another toast, their glasses clinking, their smiles bright. To them I was already forgotten. Richard Baker had drawn his line, casting me into the blizzard like a lesson to a child. But as Daniel guided me toward the SUV, his hand steady at my back, a thought rose within me, stronger than the cold, sharper than the wind. This was not the end of my story. This was the beginning. The door of the SUV closed behind me with a solid thump, sealing out the howling storm. Inside, the heat blew from the vents, thawing my frozen fingers. I pressed my hands together, trying to will the feeling back into them. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, pale and shaken, but alive. The storm raged outside, but here, cocooned in warmth and leather seats, I felt the faint stirrings of something I had nearly lost. Resolve. The house, my family, the laughter echoing behind those walls they had left me to freeze. But they did not know what was waiting for them, what this night would awaken in me. My father believed he had taught me my place. He had no idea that he had just opened the door to something he could never control. And as Daniel pulled the SUV onto the snow-covered road, headlights cutting a path through the storm, I realized I was no longer trembling from the cold. I was trembling from the fire rising in my chest, a fire I would no longer let anyone extinguish. The fire inside me had burned away the trembling, and I sat in silence as Daniel steered us through the storm. The SUV moved slowly, tires crunching over thick ice, the wipers smearing snow across the windshield. My breath fogged the glass, but the warmth of his coat on my shoulders anchored me, heavier than any embrace I had known in years. For the first time all evening, I felt something close to safe. He glanced at me, his profile lit by the dash lights. "You all right?" His voice was quiet but not fragile. It carried the tone of someone used to stepping into chaos and pulling people out of it. I nodded, though my throat was raw. My voice cracked when I finally managed words. "I would have frozen if you hadn't come." His eyes flicked back to the road. He didn't say it, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw, as though my father's cruelty wasn't a surprise. Minutes passed before he spoke again. "I know what it feels like to be left out in the cold by Richard Baker." My head snapped toward him. You know my father." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles pale against the leather. "Knew him well. Trusted him once. Lost everything for it." I waited, barely breathing, sensing the weight of whatever was about to come. "It was 6 years ago," he said, his eyes fixed on the endless swirl of snow. "I had a construction company. Small but growing. We got a bid on a city project, something big enough to put us on the map. Richard approached me, said he could help secure funding, grease the right wheels. He had the name, the connections. I thought he was a savior. I didn't know he was setting me up to fail." My stomach twisted as he spoke. "He lured me into signing guarantees, pulled strings so I'd look like the one mishandling funds. The city pulled the contract. The investors sued me. By the time the dust cleared, I was bankrupt. My wife left. My boys had to move schools. I went from building houses to driving trucks just to pay rent." He paused, eyes hard. "Richard Baker ruined me." The words slammed into me like the storm outside. My chest felt tight, every beat of my heart heavier than the last. I wanted to argue, to say my father was strict but not monstrous, but the memory of being shoved into the snow shut my mouth. Daniel continued, softer now. "People think he is untouchable. He buries evidence, buys silence, threatens anyone who steps out of line. I've been watching him ever since. I have files. Documents he never thought anyone else kept. I have enough to crack his empire, but if I go alone, they'll crush me again." My pulse hammered in my ears. "You kept all of it." He nodded once. "Every wire transfer I could trace, every fake invoice, every shell company. Years worth. But he's careful, Catalina. He knows how to cover his tracks. If it's just me, they'll say I'm bitter, a washed-up contractor trying to blame the man who beat me. But you..." His eyes flicked to me, steady and deliberate. "You are his daughter. You've seen his cruelty up close. They can't dismiss you so easily. I pressed my hands against the coat, feeling the rough stitching beneath my fingers. It was surreal. Less than an hour ago, I was choking on humiliation in front of my family. Now I was sitting beside a man who held the keys to my father's destruction. The SUV hummed along the highway, the storm pounding against the glass. But all I could hear was the blood rushing through my ears. For years, I believed silence was survival. Now silence felt like surrender. I whispered, "Why are you telling me this now?" Daniel let out a slow breath. "Because tonight he went too far. I saw him shove you outside like you were nothing. That's not just arrogance. That's a man convinced he can do anything without consequence. That's the moment you stop waiting and start fighting." His words lit a spark in me, faint but growing. Still, fear coiled tight in my stomach. "He's powerful. He'll destroy me." Daniel's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He already tried. He already thinks he has. That's the mistake. He doesn't know you've got nothing left to lose." The truth of it sank into me like stones dropped in water. Nothing left to lose. My career gone because of his interference. My dignity trampled at his dinner table. My place in the family stripped away. What else could he take? The question burned until I realized the answer. He could take my silence and turn it into his shield. That was what he always wanted. I looked out the window. The snow was easing, the edges of buildings beginning to show as we entered the city. The SUV turned onto streets I recognized, but the world felt changed. My chest ached with exhaustion, yet beneath it was something sharper. A sense that for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing alone in the storm. Daniel pulled up in front of a diner, its neon sign flickering, steam rising from vents along the roof. Inside, people sat with steaming mugs, jackets piled on chairs, laughter spilling out as the door opened and closed. He killed the engine and turned to me. "Warm up, eat something. Then, if you're ready, I'll show you the first file." My stomach growled at the thought of food, but hunger was drowned out by the thundering of my heart. I nodded, pushing the door open. The blast of cold air slapped me before I hurried inside. The diner smelled of coffee and bacon grease. The booths cracked from years of use. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a bun, handed me a menu. I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug she placed down, letting the heat seep into my bones. Daniel ordered too, his voice calm, practiced. We ate quietly at first, my mind whirling faster than I could steady it. Finally, I asked the question clawing at me. "Why didn't you go to the police with this?" Daniel stirred his coffee slowly. "Because without someone on the inside, it's just paperwork. They'll say I forged it or that I misunderstood. But with you, with your story, with the proof of what he's done, they can't ignore it." My pulse raced. He made it sound so simple, but I knew it wouldn't be. Richard Baker had built an empire on intimidation and control. But maybe Daniel was right. Maybe tonight being cast into the storm wasn't the end. Maybe it was the first step toward justice. The waitress brought pie apple with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and for a moment I let the sweetness ground me. Daniel's eyes softened as he watched me take the first bite. "You remind me of myself," he said, "back then before I lost it all. Believing I had to keep my head down, believing he was untouchable." I set my fork down, the words heavy on my tongue. Not anymore. The snow outside had slowed to a gentle fall, the storm's fury passing. But inside me another storm had begun, quiet and steady, gathering strength. And I knew when it broke it would not be me standing in its path. Not anymore. Those words hung between us, heavier than any silence. Daniel didn't push, and I was grateful for that. He let me finish my pie, sipping his coffee like a man who had learned to wait out storms. When we finally stepped back into the night, the snowfall was lighter, the streets wet and glistening under the street lamps. The cold no longer cut the way it had before. It felt like the air itself was catching its breath after the chaos. Daniel drove me to my apartment building in Milwaukee, a plain brick complex that smelled faintly of fried food and wet carpet. It wasn't much, but it was mine, the one place Richard Baker had no hand in. I hesitated at the door, holding the strap of my bag, reluctant to let Daniel go. His eyes met mine, and he said simply, "Think it over. Tomorrow I'll bring you something." Then he handed me a small scrap of paper with his number scrawled on it. I nodded, my voice too raw to answer, and watched the taillights of his SUV fade into the night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, smug and sharp in the glow of the Christmas lights as he shoved me into the snow. My chest burned with humiliation and rage, and when I did drift off, I dreamed of voices laughing as I stumbled alone in the cold. By morning, I felt hollow, like something inside me had cracked. At 8, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah Klein, my old colleague from Lakeside Financial, the firm where I had worked until 2 years ago. I hadn't spoken to her in months. Her text was blunt. Catalina, we need to talk. Coffee at Bluebird on Water Street 10, please. My stomach nodded. I had been fired from Lakeside without warning after a decade of loyalty. I'd been told it was restructuring budget cuts. But even then, I had suspected my father's hand in it. Seeing Sarah's name now felt like a door cracking open on something I had tried to bury. The Bluebird was a cozy cafe with exposed brick walls and the smell of roasted beans hanging in the air. I spotted Sarah at a corner table, her hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. She looked up as I approached, her lips tight with tension. Catalina, thank you for coming. I sat down, wrapping my hands around the warm mug the barista set in front of me. Sarah didn't waste time. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry. You lost your job because of your father. The words hit harder than I expected, even though I had long suspected them. My throat tightened. How do you know? Sarah leaned in, her voice low. I was in the conference room when the call came through. It was Richard. He told our partners you were a liability, that you were leaking sensitive information. He hinted at impropriety, said you were reckless with accounts. None of it was true, but the way he spoke, the weight he carried. They didn't question him. They fired you to keep him happy. My hands trembled around the mug. My father had destroyed my career not for incompetence, but to remind me who held the strings. Sarah's eyes shone with regret. I didn't speak up then because I was scared. He has influence, Catalina. More than you realize, but I can't carry it anymore. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were emails, memos, meeting notes, evidence. My father's name in black and white, his voice captured in directives. It was damning. It was real. My pulse quickened as I flipped through the pages. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was proof. I looked up at Sarah, my voice shaking. Why are you giving me this now? She swallowed hard. Because last night I saw the news. Someone leaked that Baker Investments is under quiet investigation. If this is the beginning, you need to be ready. You deserve to know the truth. Her words sank into me, heavy as stone. I closed the folder, sliding it into my bag like it was fragile glass. Thank you, I whispered, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me shift. Walking back to my apartment, the city felt different. The snow had melted in patches, revealing slush and asphalt. People bustled past, bundled in scarves, their lives moving on as if the world hadn't cracked open for me. I clutched my bag tight. I thought of Daniel's files, of Sarah's folder, of the years my father had stolen from me without a shred of remorse. The pieces were falling into place, sharper than glass, cutting through the haze of fear. That evening, Daniel knocked at my door. He carried a battered leather briefcase, his expression unreadable. Inside, he said simply, and I stepped aside to let him in. He set the case on my kitchen table, the metal clasp snapping open with finality. I sat across from him as he laid out documents, photographs, spreadsheets. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. Shell companies registered in Delaware, bank transfers routed through the Cayman Islands, property deeds in other people's names. Richard Baker's empire was a web, and at the center was his arrogance. Daniel's voice was steady as he explained each piece. This is one of the shell corporations he uses to funnel money. This is a subcontractor he controls through intimidation. This is where he hides taxable assets. I tried to absorb it all, my hands shaking as I traced the lines of his deception. Finally, Daniel looked at me, his eyes sharp. With what you have from Sarah and what I have here, we can build a case. But you have to decide. Do you want to fight him? I thought of the Christmas table, the laughter, the sneers as I was dragged into the cold. I thought of the years of silence, of losing my job, of being treated like an outsider in my own family. The fury that had simmered in me all night blazed. Yes, I said, my voice firm for the first time. I want to fight. Daniel nodded once as if he had expected nothing less. Then he reached into the case and pulled out one last envelope. He slid it toward me, his hand steady. You should see this. Inside was a letter, handwritten, yellowed at the edges. The signature at the bottom made my chest seize. It was my grandfather's. The letter was dated nearly 15 years ago. It spoke of a trust fund, assets meant to pass directly to me on my 30th birthday. My eyes blurred as I read, my fingers trembling. My father had hidden this. He had kept it from me, pretending all these years that I had nothing. The betrayal was so deep, it felt like drowning. I looked up at Daniel, my voice barely a whisper. He stole my inheritance. Daniel's jaw tightened. He's been bleeding it for years, moving it into his accounts, disguising it as company assets. You were never supposed to know. The room spun, anger and grief colliding inside me. My father had not only crushed my career, but he had stolen the future my grandfather had left for me. My throat burned with rage. He won't win, I said. Not this time. Daniel's eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. Then we start tomorrow. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The folder from Sarah and the documents from Daniel spread across the table. The city lights glowed outside my window, reflecting in the glass like faint stars. My father thought he had silenced me, stripped me of power, left me shivering in the snow. But for the first time, I saw the truth. The storm he had cast me into was only the beginning, and I was ready to walk through it. The next morning, I dressed in the plainest clothes I had, a gray sweater and dark jeans, as if blending in would make me less of a target. My stomach was a knot of nerves, but there was a steel thread running through it too, pulling me forward. Daniel had told me to meet him near the offices of Baker Investments, and just walking toward that building made my chest ache with memories. I had grown up believing the skyscraper downtown was a monument to my father's brilliance, his legacy. Now I saw it as a fortress of lies. The lobby was glass and marble, decorated with a massive wreath and poinsettias set on pedestals. The scent of pine mixed with the faint sting of disinfectant. I kept my head down as I crossed the floor, ignoring the security guard's glance. Upstairs, the conference rooms had been decorated for the holiday season, strings of white lights running along the edges of the walls. The Baker family board meeting was more of a spectacle than a business gathering. My siblings, cousins, and their spouses had all been invited. It wasn't unusual for them to use such meetings to flaunt power disguised as family tradition. I slipped into the back of the room unnoticed at first. My father stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit a deep navy, his tie crisp and red. His voice carried easily, confident and sharp. He was boasting about new developments, about partnerships abroad, about numbers that sparkled on the screen behind him. Applause followed every line, but it felt hollow, forced. My chest tightened with every word, but I stayed quiet, clutching the small folder Sarah had given me. Then he saw me. His smile faltered for the briefest second, and the room seemed to shift. "Well, look who decided to join us." His words dripped with sarcasm, and immediately all eyes turned. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to stand tall. I had walked in knowing he would try to humiliate me. My sister Marissa snickered under her breath, her diamond earrings swaying as she leaned toward her husband. Some of my cousins exchanged smirks, whispering. The air grew thick, and then my father spoke again. "I trust you found the snow last night refreshing, Catalina. Perhaps it cleared your head." The laughter that followed was sharp and cold. I steadied my breath. I wasn't going to run this time. I opened the folder, slowly pulling out one of the emails Sarah had given me. The sound of the paper sliding free cut through the room. I laid it on the table, my hand firm. "This is proof," I said, my voice low but carrying. "Proof that you orchestrated my dismissal from Lakeside Financial. That you destroyed my career to keep me quiet." A ripple of shock moved across the room. My father's jaw tightened, but his expression quickly smoothed into a smile. "Oh, Catalina, always the dramatist. Conspiracy theories suit you better than work ever did." But his voice held the faintest edge, and I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. Richard's business partner, a broad-shouldered man named James Morrison, leaned forward to glance at the paper. His brow furrowed, and for the first time the room wasn't entirely on my father's side. That single crease in Morrison's forehead gave me strength. I pressed on, pulling out another page. This one showed his interference with city contracts, Daniel's documents backing it up. My hands shook, but I kept moving piece by piece, laying down the truth. The murmurs grew louder, questions rising. My father slammed his hand against the table, the sharp crack silencing everyone. "Enough!" His voice thundered. The room froze, but I refused to shrink back. My body shook, yet I met his glare. "You've silenced me for years. Not anymore." For a moment, no one moved. Then Richard leaned back, a cold smile spreading across his face. "You think you're clever?" he said softly, but his eyes glittered with fury. "You think scraps of paper and a bruised ego will undo me?" His words sliced at me, but beneath them was something else. Fear. My cousin Aaron tried to laugh it off, making a joke about holiday family drama, but no one joined in this time. The spell my father always cast was cracking. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause he had ever received. I gathered the papers back into the folder, tucking them under my arm. My knees were weak, but my back stayed straight as I turned and walked toward the door. Every step away from that table felt like shedding a weight I had carried my whole life. Behind me, I heard his voice low and threatening. "This is not over, Catalina." The words chased me out of the room, but they no longer rooted me in fear. They only confirmed what I already knew. The fight had begun, and this time I would not walk it alone. Outside in the hallway, my hands trembled so badly I had to press them against the wall to steady myself. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the muffled hum of conversation seeped through the conference doors. My chest heaved, but deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, was a flicker of triumph. For the first time, I stood my ground in front of him. For the first time, I had seen the crack in his armor. I pulled out my phone and texted Daniel. It started. Minutes later, he replied, "Good. Now we move to the next step." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, exhaling slowly. My legs still shook, my throat still burned. But I felt something I hadn't in years. Power. It was faint, fragile, but it was mine, and I intended to hold on to it. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside, my reflection staring back at me from the polished steel walls. I barely recognized the woman standing there, eyes fierce despite the tremor in her hands. The snow outside had begun to fall again, soft and quiet, but inside me the storm was just beginning. I walked out of the Baker Investments Tower with my folder pressed tight against my chest. The winter wind sliced at my cheeks, but the sting only reminded me I was alive, moving forward. My boots crunched over ice as I made my way down the block, my phone buzzing in my pocket. It was Daniel again. "Meet me at the old library on State Street. Bring what you showed them." The library had been closed for years, a red brick building with boarded windows and a heavy oak door that still opened if you pushed hard enough. Inside it smelled of dust and old wood, the echo of footsteps bouncing off marble floors. Daniel stood near a table in the center, his coat draped over a chair, the leather briefcase at his side. He didn't smile when I walked in. Instead, he gestured to the table where files were already spread out. "Catalina, we need to move quickly. Your father will be scrambling to contain what you did today." I set my folder beside his, my hands still trembling. "They laughed," I whispered. "They laughed at me in that room, but I saw it in his eyes. He was afraid." Daniel nodded slowly. "Fear makes him dangerous. That means we press harder." He pulled a document forward, the paper thin and creased. It was a subcontract agreement, one of dozens he had collected. "Look at the signatures," he said, tapping the bottom line. "They are forged. Every single one of them. This is how he siphoned money through dummy companies." I leaned closer, tracing the loops of handwriting with my eyes. They looked authentic at first, but as Daniel laid the pages side by side, the patterns emerged. Same curves, same pressure. A signature machine, not a pen. My stomach twisted. "And nobody noticed?" He smiled grimly. "He pays people not to notice. But now we have more than copies." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a flash drive, placing it in my hand. Inside are audio recordings. A whistleblower gave them to me 2 years ago before he disappeared. They capture Richard giving orders to falsify numbers. He thought he had buried it, but I kept a copy. My fingers curled around the drive, my breath uneven. This was beyond family betrayal. This was criminal. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it pressing down. Finally, Daniel said, "If we combine this with Sarah's documents and your testimony, we have leverage. But we need someone who can handle the legal side. Someone who won't be bought." I thought of Eleanor Wright, my mother's old friend who had become a respected attorney. She had always told me, "If you ever need me, I'll be there." My father had mocked her, dismissed her as small time. Maybe that was exactly why she could help. She didn't owe him anything. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He frowned at the screen. He's already moving. His PR team is drafting statements, spinning what happened today as family drama. "By morning, the papers will call you unstable." I clenched my fists. Let them. For once I have the truth. The next day, we met Eleanor at her office, a modest suite above a row of shops downtown. The air smelled of coffee and printer ink, the shelves stacked with binders. She looked older than I remembered, her gray hair cropped short, her face lined but sharp. When she saw me, her eyes softened. "Catalina." I heard, "Sit, tell me everything." I laid the folder on her desk, then Daniel opened his case, sliding the documents across. Eleanor adjusted her glasses, scanning quickly, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. When she reached the forged signatures, she leaned back her chair, creaking. "This is serious. This is fraud on a large scale." She looked at me, her eyes piercing. "Are you ready to testify against your father?" My throat tightened, but I forced myself to nod, yes. She studied me for a moment, then reached for the phone. "I know a federal contact who owes me a favor, but once this starts, there's no turning back. He will fight with everything he has." Her words should have scared me, but instead I felt a strange calm. I had already been cast out. There was nothing left for him to take. That evening, Daniel and I drove back through the city, headlights cutting through the falling snow. We stopped at a diner on the outskirts where truckers filled the booths. He ordered burgers and coffee, but neither of us ate much. He leaned across the table, his voice low. "Once Eleanor makes the call, your father will sense it. He'll come for you harder than ever." I swallowed hard, staring at the greasy menu between us. Let him. He wanted me silent. Now he'll have to face me. Daniel's gaze lingered on me, and for the first time I saw something like respect in his eyes. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. When he dropped me off at my apartment later that night, the street was silent, snow piling along the sidewalks. I climbed the stairs slowly, fatigue heavy in my bones. But when I reached my door, I froze. An envelope was taped to the wood, my name scrawled across it in thick black ink. My pulse quickened as I peeled it free, stepping inside before I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were typed cold and precise. "Stop now or you will regret it." My hands shook as I read it again, the threat sinking into my chest. But instead of fear, a fire rose in me. He thought intimidation would still work. He hadn't learned. I placed the note on the table beside Sarah's folder and Daniel's documents. Then I sat down, my breath steadying. If he wanted war, he had just declared it. I barely slept that night, staring at the ceiling while the words from that typed letter replayed in my mind. "Stop now or you will regret it." Every muscle in my body was tense, but underneath the fear there was a steady drumbeat of resolve. By dawn, I was up pacing the living room, the sound of the radiator clanking against the cold as snow blew against the window. At 8, my phone buzzed. It was Eleanor. She asked me to meet her in her office immediately. Her voice was clipped no pleasantries, which told me she had news. I wrapped myself in my coat and scarf and stepped into the sharp winter air, the streets already covered in fresh powder. Her office felt warmer than the day before, though maybe it was just the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the room. She didn't waste time. "The judge granted us an emergency hearing," she said, sliding papers across her desk. "Tomorrow morning. We'll present the preliminary evidence of fraud and abandonment. That gives us less than 24 hours to prepare." The weight of her words pressed down on me, but I nodded. I had asked for this fight, and now it was here. Eleanor studied my face. "He will try to twist everything. He'll make you out to be a bitter daughter, unstable, looking for revenge. Are you ready to handle that in court?" I thought of my father's smirk at Christmas dinner. The laughter that had followed me into the blizzard. The way his voice had dripped with superiority as he told me I needed to learn my place. "Yes," I said. "I am ready." That evening, Daniel came to my apartment carrying his briefcase and a thermos of soup. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were alive with focus. We spread everything across my small dining table, page after page of contracts, financial transfers, and emails. He showed me one document in particular, pointing to a transaction highlighted in yellow. "This is key. It proves money was funneled offshore through accounts in the Cayman Islands. Combined with the forged signatures, it paints a clear picture of systematic fraud." Eleanor arrived later, her coat dusted with snow, her hands full of color-coded binders. She set them down with a heavy thud. "We will organize everything into 3 categories: fraud, financial abuse, and abandonment. Catalina, your testimony ties it all together." We worked for hours, the clock slipping toward midnight as snow kept falling outside, thickening the silence of the city. At one point, Eleanor leaned back and looked at me carefully. "Your mother will be called to the stand," she said. My stomach clenched. Mom was fragile, her health unsteady, but Eleanor assured me she had already spoken with her. She is willing. She told me she has things she wants to say, things she has kept to herself for too long. When Eleanor left around 2 in the morning, Daniel stayed behind, pouring us both coffee. He looked at me over the rim of his mug. "I know what this costs you, Catalina. But tomorrow, if this goes the way we hope, your father will no longer be untouchable." I stared at the piles of evidence on the table, the stacks of papers that represented years of corruption. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe the scales were tipping. The courthouse the next morning loomed gray against the winter sky, its stone steps slick with ice. I walked inside with Daniel and Eleanor on either side of me, the echo of our footsteps in the marble hall. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, but I held my head high. The courtroom itself smelled faintly of polish and old wood. I sat behind the long table, hands clasped together, while Eleanor arranged her binders, and Daniel placed the flash drive carefully beside her. Across the room, my father entered with his attorney, a man I recognized from magazine covers, expensive and ruthless. Richard wore his favorite tailored suit, his silver hair combed back, his expression cool and dismissive. His eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of disdain passing over his face before he turned to the judge. The proceedings began quickly. The judge, a stern woman with steel gray hair, asked for opening statements. Eleanor rose, her voice steady and clear, outlining the case in precise terms. She spoke of financial discrepancies, of forged signatures, of intimidation and abandonment. She laid out the foundation without embellishment, letting the weight of the facts hang in the air. Then Richard's lawyer stood. He painted me as a disgruntled daughter resentful of her father's success, inventing accusations out of jealousy and spite. He gestured toward me more than once, his tone laced with condescension. My cheeks burned, but I kept my eyes forward, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. When Eleanor called me to the stand, my pulse raced. I walked slowly, each step heavy, the courtroom silent except for the creak of the floor beneath my shoes. I sat, the oath ringing in my ears, and began to speak. I told them about Christmas dinner, about being dragged out into the snow, about standing there shivering while my family laughed inside. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I continued. I spoke of the years of manipulation, the financial control, the threats disguised as lessons. I told them about the envelope taped to my door. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. When I finished, I glanced at the jury box. Their faces were unreadable, but I saw one woman's jaw tighten, her eyes flicking toward Richard with something close to disgust. Then Eleanor called our first piece of hard evidence. Daniel inserted the flash drive, and the courtroom filled with my father's voice. He was instructing someone to falsify numbers, his tone casual, almost bored. Hearing it made my skin crawl. Across the room, Richard's expression flickered just for a moment, a crack in his polished mask. As the day wore on, we presented document after document, Eleanor guiding the narrative with careful precision. Richard's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed most of it. By late afternoon, my head pounded, my throat raw from speaking, but the case was building like a wall around my father, brick by damning brick. When court adjourned for the day, I walked out into the crisp evening air, my breath forming clouds before me. Daniel touched my arm gently. "You did well," he said, "better than you realize. But this is only the beginning. Tomorrow will be harder." I nodded, my body aching with exhaustion, but my spirit steady. For the first time, my father was being forced to answer for what he had done. As I stepped onto the icy sidewalk, snowflakes drifting onto my coat, I knew the fight was far from over. But I also knew I was no longer standing alone in the storm. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, the streets glazed with ice that glistened like broken glass under the dim light. My boots slipped as I crossed the courthouse steps, Daniel steadying me with a hand on my elbow. Inside the marble halls, the buzz of voices carried, reporters clustered near the doors, cameras flashing as soon as my father swept through the entrance. He looked unshaken, his navy suit immaculate, his posture tall, as if yesterday's testimony had not touched him at all. But I saw the twitch in his jaw when he caught sight of me. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something sharp, his lips curling in irritation. The mask was cracking, if only slightly. By mid-morning, the hearing shifted focus. Eleanor submitted bank records traced back more than a decade. Pages of transactions, highlighted in yellow amounts, transferred quietly, often on holidays or late at night. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, her expression tightening. Richard's lawyer jumped up, objecting, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, but the objection was overruled. When my father finally took the stand, the air thickened. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and fixed his gaze on the jury. His voice was steady, smooth, rehearsed. He painted himself as a generous patriarch, a misunderstood businessman whose only flaw was expecting too much from those around him. He called me an ungrateful child who resented his success, who invented stories to justify my own failures. Each word sliced through me, but I held my face still, my hands clenched under the table. The courtroom was silent except for his voice, carrying with practiced confidence. Then Eleanor rose for cross-examination. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Baker," she asked, "do you deny instructing your employees to falsify numbers in company accounts?" My father's eyes narrowed, his lips twisting into a faint smile. "Absolutely, I would never do such a thing." Eleanor nodded slightly, then pressed play on another audio file. His voice filled the room again, unmistakable, directing someone to adjust figures so investors would not suspect. Gasps rippled through the gallery. My father's face went rigid, but still he tried to laugh it off. Out of context, he insisted, "Just office banter." Eleanor leaned closer, her words precise. "Banter does not move millions of dollars offshore, Mr. Baker." The tension in the room tightened until it felt hard to breathe. That afternoon, we reconvened in the boardroom of Baker Investments. Though it was not part of the court proceedings, Eleanor insisted we appear before the company's board of directors. She said it was time to show them what their CEO had been hiding. The boardroom was sleek, all glass walls and polished oak. Men and women in expensive suits sat around the long table, murmuring among themselves as we entered. My father stood at the head, arms folded, his expression cold and furious. "You have no right to be here," he snapped. Eleanor set a stack of binders on the table, her voice cutting through the silence. "On the contrary, the shareholders do, and they will want to hear this." Daniel connected a laptop to the projector, the screen filling with charts and records. Transfers to shell companies inflated invoices off the book accounts. Each slide chipped away at the illusion of control my father had built. The directors shifted in their seats, some whispering, others frowning openly. My father slammed a hand on the table. "Enough! This is a witch hunt! You all know what I have done for this company. Without me, none of you would have jobs." I rose slowly, my heart pounding. Without you, they would still have integrity. For a moment, silence fell like a heavy curtain. My father's face turned red, veins rising along his neck. He lunged forward, pointing a finger at me. "You are nothing. You were always nothing. You should be grateful I gave you a roof, an education, a name. Without me, you are worthless." The room froze. I heard the intake of breath from the directors, the creak of leather chairs as they shifted uncomfortably. His words echoed cruel and raw, impossible to disguise as anything but contempt. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady but sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard how he treats his own daughter. Imagine how he treats his clients, his employees, his partners." The board erupted in murmurs, heads shaking, eyes darting toward one another. My father tried to recover, smoothing his tie, but the damage was done. We left the building as the winter sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the snow. I felt drained, as if my bones had been hollowed out. But under the exhaustion was something else, a shift. For the first time, his power had faltered in front of those who once worshipped him. Daniel walked beside me in silence, his breath fogging in the cold. Finally, he said, "You realize what just happened, don't you?" He lost control. And they saw it. I knotted my chest tight. The war wasn't over, but the first crack had opened wide enough for everyone to see. That night, as I sat at my small kitchen table, the hum of the radiator filling the quiet, I thought of the years I had spent under his thumb. The fear, the silence, the careful steps to avoid his wrath, all of it had led to this moment. And though tomorrow would bring more battles, tonight I allowed myself a single, steady breath of victory. The next morning, that fragile calm shattered with a knock at my apartment door. I opened it to find a young woman standing in the hallway, her blonde hair tucked under a knit cap, her eyes darting nervously. She held a manila folder close to her chest as if it were armor. "Are you Catalina?" she asked softly. My stomach clenched. "Yes." She bit her lip, then pushed the folder into my hands. "I used to work for your father. I can't keep quiet anymore." I motioned her inside, my pulse racing. She stepped in, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to follow. She introduced herself as Megan Alvarez, 27, once a junior accountant at Baker Investments. Her hands trembled as she sat on the edge of my couch. "He made me doctor statements," she said, her voice cracking. At first I thought it was just harmless adjustments, but then he threatened me. Said if I ever spoke, I'd never work in finance again. I opened the folder and felt my throat tighten. Inside were photocopies of internal emails, spreadsheets marked confidential, and one particularly damning memo with my father's signature instructing Megan to reroute funds through an offshore account. This was more than a thread. This was a rope strong enough to pull down his empire. Daniel arrived minutes later, called by my shaky voice over the phone. He flipped through the papers quickly, his jaw tightening. "This is it," he said. "This connects his orders directly to the fraud." Megan shifted uncomfortably, her hands twisting in her lap. "I know he'll come after me if he finds out. I've been carrying this for over a year. I couldn't sleep anymore." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "You did the right thing. You're not alone." By noon, we were back in Eleanor's office. She read the new evidence in silence, then closed the folder and looked at us with grim satisfaction. "This tips the scale. With this and the recordings, we can push for federal charges. But we need to protect Megan." She agreed to file a sworn affidavit and testify if needed, though fear still lingered in her eyes. That evening, Eleanor arranged a secure call with a federal investigator she trusted. I listened as Daniel explained the evidence, Megan chiming in with hesitant but clear answers. The investigator's voice was calm but sharp. "This is substantial. We'll open a case immediately. Keep everything under lock. Do not communicate electronically." After the call, exhaustion weighed on us all. Megan left for a safe apartment Eleanor had arranged, her small frame hunched as she disappeared into the snowy night. Daniel lingered behind, his eyes meeting mine. He will know soon. And when he does, he'll strike back harder. I thought of the note taped to my door, the sneer on my father's face in the boardroom. The years of control he had exercised without consequence. "Let him strike," I whispered. "We're ready now." The next day in court, Eleanor introduced Megan's affidavit. Richard's attorney objected violently, his voice echoing through the chamber, but the judge allowed it. The jury leaned forward as Eleanor read excerpts aloud, Megan's words trembling on the page. My father's face turned ashen, his jaw tightening with every line. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, his hand gripping this table so hard his knuckles whitened. When recess was called, I stepped into the hallway, my body trembling with adrenaline. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, cameras flashing, but I pushed through, Daniel at my side. Then a voice cut through the chaos. Catalina. I froze. Standing at the end of the hall was a woman I recognized instantly. Tall, elegant dark hair cascading over her shoulders. It was Anna Reynolds, my father's longtime assistant, the one rumored to be closer to him than any employee should have been. She walked toward me slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Her eyes held something I hadn't expected. Not hostility, desperation. I need to talk to you, she said under her breath. Not here, tonight. She slipped a folded note into my hand, her fingers cold against mine, then turned sharply and disappeared into the crowd before I could respond. Back in the courtroom, my mind raced. What did she know? Why now? That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the note. It was scrawled in hurried handwriting. Meet me at the diner on 3rd Avenue. Midnight. Come alone. Daniel and Eleanor both warned me it could be a trap. But something in Anna's eyes had stirred my curiosity. She looked like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear. Against their advice, I went. The diner was nearly empty at midnight, the neon sign buzzing, the smell of frying bacon lingering in the air. Anna sat in a booth near the back, her coat draped over her shoulders, her hands clasped tightly around a coffee cup. She looked up as I approached her face, pale, her lips pressed thin. You don't know what he's capable of, she whispered, once I slid into the booth. I've been keeping his secrets for years, but it's gone too far. She pulled a small recorder from her purse and set it on the table. He thought I erased everything, but I didn't. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the tiny diner, cold and calculating. He was speaking to her about hiding assets, about paying off inspectors, about ruining anyone who stood in his way. Then his tone shifted darker. If Catalina keeps pushing, she'll end up regretting it. Make sure she understands that. My stomach lurched, the room tilting around me. Anna's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to do it, she said. I told him I would try, but I never did. I couldn't. She pushed the recorder toward me. Use it. End this. I sat there frozen, the recorder warm in my hands, the truth undeniable. My father wasn't just ruthless. He was willing to destroy his own child to protect himself. When I finally walked out of the diner, the wind cut across the empty street, the snow crunching under my boots. I held the recorder tight in my pocket, my heart pounding. Another weapon. Another crack in his empire. But I also knew something else. If he found out Anna had betrayed him, her life could be in danger. And for the first time, I realized this fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone he had trapped in his shadow. The following morning, I barely slept, my head heavy with the sound of my father's voice threatening me from that recorder. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the device, the sun creeping through thin blinds, painting the floor with stripes of light. Daniel knocked on the door at 8, his coat still damp from the snow outside. One look at me, and he knew something had shifted. I slid the recorder across the table. He pressed play, listened, and when the last words faded, his eyes hardened. This is the nail in his coffin. Eleanor's office was quiet, except for the hum of the heater when we arrived. She listened to the recording twice, her hands folded, her expression unreadable until the end. Then she leaned forward, her voice low. With this, we don't just have fraud, we have threats. The court will see his character for what it is. She paused, then added, we file immediately. By noon, the evidence was in motion. The recorder copied, transcripts typed, affidavits prepared. Megan agreed to verify that the voice was indeed his. Anna, trembling but resolute, signed her statement in Eleanor's office, her fingers shaking as she dotted the final signature. For the first time, I saw in her a strange mix of fear and relief, like someone stepping out of a locked room into fresh air. The trial reconvened the next week in a packed courtroom. My father sat across from me, his eyes narrowing when Eleanor announced the new evidence. His lawyer barked objections, shouting about entrapment, about privacy, about anything that might derail the judge's focus. But the judge silenced him with a stern glance. Play the recording. The sound of his voice filled the chamber, cold and commanding, describing schemes to launder money, to silence people, to make me regret my defiance. I watched the jurors lean back, their expressions shifting from doubt to disgust. Some shook their heads. My father clenched his fists under the table, his jaw twitching. When the recording ended, silence spread heavy as snowfall. Eleanor rose, her voice steady as steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the voice of a man protecting his family or his company. This is the voice of a man who will sacrifice anyone, even his own daughter, to feed his greed." The rest of that day felt like a blur, testimony flowing, documents projected on the screen, witnesses speaking one after another. Megan testified with trembling courage. Anna confirmed details only an insider could know. Daniel walked the court through financial patterns, showing exactly where the money went. Each piece stacked like bricks in a wall closing in around him. During recess, I stepped into the hallway, the weight of it all pressing on me. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. It read simply, "Leave town tonight if you value your life." I froze, the hallway spinning. Daniel noticed immediately, grabbed the phone, showed Eleanor. She didn't flinch. "He is desperate. This is good for us. It shows his panic. But for your safety, Catalina, we will arrange protection." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak in the building, every car passing on the street. Fear coiled tight in my chest, but beneath it was a rising determination. He wanted me to run, I would not. The next day in court was even worse for him. A federal agent testified about suspicious transfers tied to shell companies in Panama. Screenshots of his failed attempts to access frozen accounts were shown. The judge's expression darkened by the hour. When the agent finished, Eleanor requested to enter new evidence, the note that had been slipped under my door weeks ago. The handwriting analysis matched his chief of security, a man long loyal to him. The implication was clear. Intimidation was part of his strategy. For the first time, I saw a crack in his mask. His shoulders sagged slightly, his eyes darting to the gallery as if looking for a way out. When court adjourned that evening, the air outside felt sharper, the snow crunching under my boots as Daniel and I walked toward his car. My phone buzzed again. This time it was not a threat. It was Jennifer, my cousin from Milwaukee, someone I had not spoken to in years. Her voice message shook with urgency. "Catalina, I know things about him, about what he did to my mother. Call me, please." I sat in the car, phone pressed to my chest, my breath fogging the window. Another twist, another thread unraveling from his carefully woven lies. The next morning, Jennifer arrived at Eleanor's office, her eyes red from crying. She carried a shoebox filled with old letters and bank statements. She explained how my father had convinced her mother, his own sister, to invest her retirement savings into one of his funds years ago. The money had disappeared, the explanation vague, the family too ashamed to pursue it. But the letters showed his manipulation in detail. I watched Eleanor's expression tighten as she sorted through the papers. This adds another layer. It shows a pattern that goes back decades. In court later that week, Jennifer testified. Her voice cracked as she described her mother's trust, the loss, the depression that followed. The jurors looked stricken. My father shifted uncomfortably, finally breaking his cold posture, his face red. The avalanche of evidence was unstoppable now. Every twist cut deeper, every testimony stripped more of his armor. He glared at me across the room, and for the first time I did not feel fear. I felt pity for a man who had built his life on cruelty and lies, only to watch it collapse. That evening, I returned to my apartment and sat by the window, staring at the city lights. My phone buzzed once more. It was Anna. Her voice trembled. "He knows. He confronted me. I don't think I'm safe anymore." I gripped the phone tight, my chest tightening. The battle was nearly over, but now it was no longer just about justice. It was about survival. I called Anna back immediately, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. She whispered that my father had cornered her in his office, his voice low and venomous, accusing her of betrayal. She had managed to leave under the excuse of a family emergency, but she was certain he would send someone after her. I told her to go directly to Eleanor's office, not her apartment, not anywhere familiar. Daniel drove through the storm to meet her there, while I sat in my apartment with the curtains drawn tight, my body tense like a wire. The next morning, the courthouse felt like a stage where the final act of a long play was about to unfold. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, voices rising. Inside, the jury filed back in with solemn faces. Eleanor rose to give her closing statement, her voice calm and unwavering. She spoke of fraud, of intimidation, of betrayal within a family, of how my father had used fear as his weapon. Then she played one final clip from Anna's recorder, his threat against me. The courtroom went still. When his attorney tried to recover, his words fell flat, his argument sounding hollow against the mountain of evidence. My father sat with his head down, his face gray, his hands trembling as if he finally felt the weight of everything crashing down. The judge returned after deliberation with an expression that carved the air. The verdict was guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, witness intimidation, abuse of power. The room erupted, half in gasps, half in whispers. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me like a tide I had been waiting for all my life. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. I sat in the front row, Daniel and Eleanor beside me, Anna and Megan just behind. The judge's voice was steady, cutting through the silence. Richard Baker, you targeted your own family, your clients, and your employees. You caused harm that rippled through lives for decades. You showed no remorse. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison. I looked at him one last time as marshals led him away. He did not look back at me. For once, his eyes did not hold power, only emptiness. The weeks that followed felt like learning to breathe again. I poured my energy into helping Eleanor build a foundation for victims of financial abuse, a place where women could find protection, legal help, and the courage to step out of the shadows. Anna worked quietly behind the scenes. Megan took on a role in financial literacy training, and Jennifer donated part of her inheritance once she recovered what was left of her mother's savings. Sometimes I thought about that night in the blizzard when my father dragged me outside to humiliate me in front of everyone, laughing as I stood shaking in the snow. He believed I would stay broken. Instead, that night became the beginning of his downfall. 1 year later, I returned to that same house for the first time. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown, the driveway covered in leaves. I stood there for a long time, the wind cold against my face, remembering the girl I had been and the woman I had become. Then I turned away, walking back to Daniel's car, leaving the past behind. Justice had not erased the scars, but it had given me back my voice, my dignity, and my freedom. If you have ever felt silenced or cast aside, I hope my story reminds you that cruelty cannot stand forever, that lies unravel, and that the truth has its own strength. Tell me in the comments if you have ever witnessed someone getting the justice they deserved, or if you believe in karma finding its way back. And if this story spoke to you, share it, subscribe, and let others know they are not alone.